Pull up, grab the fuel nozzle, and get ready to fuel up on trends and strategies to grow your travel center business in this episode of the Truckstop's Ear, brought to you by NATSO. Now, here's your host, Amy Toner.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Truckstop's Here. I'm your host, Amy Toner. You are listening to NATSO's podcast. NATSO is the National Association for Truck Stops and Travel Centers. And our mission is to advance the success of truck stops and travel centers. And this podcast is one of the many ways that we do that. And today I am joined by Rob Baker, shareholder at Chartwell Law and also a NATSO member. Hey, Rob.
Hello, how are you today?
Good. He is going to give us an update and details on OSHA's emergency temporary standard. Can you just start by telling everyone what's happening, what they need to know, what the law is?
Sure. Yeah. So for the ETS, the emergency temporary standard, there are three components. One relates to federal contractors, subcontractors. The second relates to individuals in the healthcare setting. So not necessarily something that would apply to your members directly, most likely. But then the third is the emergency temporary standard for all employers with 100 or more employees. So they're all somewhat different, but the goal is really to mandate either COVID testing or more importantly, mandatory vaccinations.
Mm-hmm. And where I know, this is going to come out very soon. So can you tell us where it is in the process of coming out?
Sure, absolutely. So the portion as it relates to healthcare setting, those facilities that accept Medicare or Medicaid payments, that has been in place. That's already been implemented by the federal government and OSHA, and that too applies to employers with over 100 employees. That portion of these mandates is being challenged in the federal courts. So it's been stayed or been postponed by the federal courts. The same applies to the federal agencies. Now, this standard has actually been in effect since October 15 of 2021. But as of even just yesterday, the federal courts are starting to pause the government mandate that federal contractors, subcontractors, and employees get their vaccinations or the testing. The biggest portion really is the ETS for general employers. That is also stated. It was supposed to go into effect on January 4 of 2022. There have been numerous appeals filed, and they have been consolidated before the Sixth Circuit. And the federal government and OSHA has since taken the position that they're not going to enforce the OSHA mandate for the ETS until additional guidance and input is provided. There's a comment period that was supposed to expire in early January. That has been delayed until January 19th of 2022. So my impression is that until such time that the courts establish a trial schedule, that there's going to be no action. That doesn't mean, though, Amy, that employers should do nothing between now and late January.
Yeah. What is your advice on that?
Yeah. So my advice is that employers should start looking at, one, are they covered? Are they a covered entity? For the general ETS, employers that have 100 or more employees, firm-wide, not at a specific location, would be, generally speaking, a covered entity. Now, there are exclusions for people that are remote employees or those that work exclusively outdoors. Those don't count for purposes of headcount. But by and large, if you have 100 or more employees, you're going to be covered. So what does that mean? It means you need to start developing policies and procedures to address the vaccination status of each employee, whether or not there has been documentation or proof of vaccination. These employers will need to maintain records of vaccination status, as well as a running roster of those that have been vaccinated or not vaccinated. The other component that is really important is that the the mandate provides for up to 4 hours of paid time to receive each dose of the vaccine. And as a extrapolation, then the COVID booster, as well as time off to recover. So it's 4 hours in total. That's the first component that employers need to be looking at is how do we comply if we're going to mandate vaccines? They have to mandate vaccines.
Yeah.
In some cases, though, employers will have to address individuals that may have bona fide accommodation, whether it's a religious accommodation under Title VII or a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. In those situations, employers are required to begin mandating weekly testing. The weekly testing would have to be built in. I had spoken the other day about this as well, and theoretically that testing would fall within wage and hour provisions where employers should start looking at their scheduling to want to make sure that employees have time off, that paid time off I talked about for the for the vaccination, but also to make sure that the employees are complying with the mandated testing. For those folks that aren't vaccinated, they will have to continue to wear face masks at all times, especially if they are indoors or in a vehicle with another employee for work purposes. And best practice would be also to continue to socially distance. Also, as part of this overriding ETS, there are notice requirements. So employers need to start looking at providing information about the requirements of the ETS in general. Again, establishing and disseminating the workplace policies and procedures. Best practice, I think, would be to not only post that to comply with the ETS, but perhaps have employee meetings and signed acknowledgments to make sure that there's documentation that the employees are aware of it. There's a document called Key Things to Know About COVID-19. That's from the CDC. That has to be posted and provided to employees as well. Again, there are provisions both in Title VII and the ADA, but also under the ETS that protect employees against retaliation or discrimination. So employers need to develop those notices as well to protect employees and reinforce that they have rights under the ETS, but also to make sure that employees are aware that if they falsify documentation, that there could be criminal penalties and sanctions. That COVID card that most people have, if that's falsified, that's actually a federal offense. You can go to prison for falsifying those documents. And then the ETS, this is really important. The ETS outlines that for employees that receive the information, employers have to disseminate it in a language and at a literacy level where the employees would understand. So in other words, if the workforce is Spanish speaking, these notices need to be posted and disseminated in Spanish. If they are Chinese, then it needs to be posted in Chinese, so on and so forth. So there are a number of nuances that employers need to be aware of to begin preparing, because the worst thing an employer could do, in my opinion, is wait until the appellate process is finalized, and the next thing we know, we're late January, maybe early February. The ETS becomes effective, and employers aren't prepared. I say that because there are per violation penalties of up to $14,000. So for each individual, if there's non-compliance, that could be a $14,000 penalty assessed by OSHA. And for any employer, that would add up fairly quickly, I imagine.
We just had a webinar with NATSO, and I sort of kept track of the questions that people asked the NATSO members. And I know they had questions about the religious exemptions.
Yes. So some of the questions regarding the religious accommodation were, one, how do you engage in that process? And two, what would be examples of perhaps a request that would be a bona fide request versus one that perhaps isn't? So under the religious accommodation issues for Title VII, if an employee has what's called a sincerely held religious belief against the vaccine, or any vaccination or treatment for that matter, the employee may engage with the employer to request an exemption or an accommodation. the question that came up was, well, what would be an accommodation in this situation for under the ETS? And it could be a few. It could be one, perhaps the vaccine isn't, say the Moderna vaccine isn't the best for that individual, but they're trying to get the Pfizer or J&J vaccine. Some of these vaccines were developed differently than others. So the examples that I provided earlier were if you say you have an individual who follows the pagan faith and they are against all vaccines, including the COVID vaccinations, and they're requesting the accommodation, you can actually request from the employee written documentation to explain how, from the church, how the pagan belief has this issue with vaccines and what the issue is and how it is derived from the religion. Oftentimes, individuals won't provide documentation, or companies or school districts or whatnot won't request the documentation. They may simply accept the request as fact, but that's not what the employer has to do. They can actually request documentation and go through the process to determine what the sincerely held religious belief is. So if the employee, for example, has been working remotely, they request the religious accommodation and they can continue to work remotely unvaccinated, that would be a reasonable accommodation under Title VII. The step, though, would then be that it would be prudent not to have employees coming to company-sponsored functions or events that may not be fully vaccinated. I know that for my clients, that's the stance that we have been taking, that if an employee is able to perform their job remotely or masked, that they may not necessarily be allowed to attend, a company-sponsored picnic or holiday party or, softball game or something to that effect. The other side of it is, though, for example, if you have an individual from the Catholic faith that is requesting an accommodation because they say that they're against the vaccine as a religious belief, that would not be something that most likely would be granted, because even though the Moderna and Pfizer vaccinations were developed through stem cell research, and Catholic faith has issues with stem cell research as it relates to harvesting and abortion, the Pope has given direction to the Catholic faith that the vaccines are perfectly acceptable under the religious faith. So a Catholic person asking for a religious accommodation would not be likely be granted, because that's not a sincerely held religious belief based upon the direction from the Pope.
Okay, and they had asked if they have this waiver for health or religious, are they exempt? And they're exempt from vaccinations. Are they also exempt from the testing and mask wearing?
So the requirements for testing and mask wearing apply to employers with 100 or more employees. So if they are unvaccinated and the ETS covers has the scope for the employer, the employees, I think by definition, would be mandated to undergo the testing and mask wearing. The accommodation doesn't alleviate the alternative to vaccination under the ETS.
No, we've gotten a lot of questions whether this would be extended to companies with less than 100 employees. What do you think?
Yes. So the ETS itself for general industry applies to employers with 100 or more employees. However, there are state and local mandates that cover all employers. So this doesn't supersede necessarily stricter requirements at the state or local level. I've also taken the position, and it's my opinion, that the general duty clause under OSHA would really enforce and encourage all employers, regardless of size, to take these measures. And in fact, employers of all size, they can require documentation for COVID vaccines. There are ways in which the EEOC has provided guidance on mandating vaccines for companies that is legally compliant and doesn't violate one's rights under the ADA or Title VII, as well as during the pre-employment process. So while the smaller employer under 100 employees, if you will, isn't technically covered by the ETS, In my opinion, it makes sense to continue to encourage vaccinations and mask wearing and social distancing if they're not vaccinated. The Title VII issues and the ADA issues would apply to employers well below 100 employee threshold counts, down to 15, depending on the law. So they would still have this issue of engaging in potential accommodation requests if there was a requirement, a company policy to have mandated vaccines or mandatory testing or mask wearing.
Okay, this one is more detailed, but which tests are going to be considered applicable? I don't think I can say that word. Rapid tests or home tests?
So the ETS as written would require the more effective testing. The rapid home tests, as I read the ETS, those won't qualify as appropriate testing. With all that being said, as recently as this morning, the federal government is now going to be making available to all individuals at no cost at-home rapid testing. So it will be interesting to see if during the comment period through January 19th that there are revisions thereafter, because everything with COVID is evolving. Every day there's something else that has changed. So the guidance for the testing may actually, in fact, change, because one of the issues with testing is who's going to pay for it. The employer doesn't have to pay for the testing. The health carriers likely don't have to pay for the health testing unless it's a medical necessity. So the question would be, does the employee have to pay for it, or is the government going to bear the cost? So this might be an area of the mandate that may be actually revised in some way after the appeal, the comment period expires on January 19th.
Anything else that you feel like our members need to know?
I think the most important thing is for your members to keep up on just the general status of the ETS, not necessarily follow all of the appellate courts and the circuit courts for appeal, but there's plenty of information in the news every day, even if you're only listening for 5 minutes or reading a few articles, to know if it's going to be implemented or if it is or when. My personal opinion is that the employers should prepare as if this is going to be the mandates in early or late January, because it's easier to, I think, modify something that has already been prepared rather than trying to develop a program, policy, and procedure that can be rather extensive depending on the size of the company in relatively short time.
So before I ask you my fun questions, you are a partner shareholder at Chartwell Law, and you're a member of NATSO. So I just want to make sure people know how to contact you if they have more questions.
Absolutely. I can be reached by email. My email is rbaker@chartwelllaw, CHARTWELLLAW.com. You can call me as well. My direct number is area code 717-686-9382. If there are any questions, or if anyone would like to discuss any of these issues or other issues in greater detail, I'm always available and happy to chat.
Okay, awesome. All right, before we let you go, we're going to ask you my fast fill questions. All right, okay. You ready? What is your go-to on-the-road snack?
My go-to on-the-road snack, honestly, is probably some sort of fruit and cheese.
Okay. Do you prefer to ride or drive?
I prefer to drive.
Okay. If you're stuck at a truck stop in a snowstorm, how are you going to pass the time?
I think it depends on what time of day it is. I'd probably try to get as much work done as I could and then go have a snowball fight.
Perfect. Okay. And then how do you take your truck stop coffee?
With cream.
With cream. Okay. And this might be a little out of your wheelhouse, but it's a controversial question, which is the term truck stop, travel center, or travel plaza the best?
Like any good attorney, I would say it depends, and I don't really have an opinion.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Okay. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Truck Stops Here. You can find us online at natso.com/podcast. If you have any questions you'd like us to answer on the podcast, please reach out to me at editor@natso.com. Bye.
The Truck Stops Here was brought to you by NATSO. the association representing truck stops and travel centers. Visit NATSO.com for more information. The Truck Stops Here is produced by NATSO in collaboration with Human Factor. Producers are Amy Toner and Darren Schulte.